Now, one of the best known slogans of the 60s is the claim that the personal is political. Although no one is sure who first said this, nevertheless, it expresses the spirit of the time. We used to say it to each other all the time. Of course, in any era, people bring their personal history to their political life. But in our book, Radicals, we relate the personal stories of 20 people from our generation who rejected the political views and values of their family, school, church, or class. These radical about turns were often accompanied by epiphanies, awakenings, revelations, or other such, what we call them is aha moments. Now, I'll just talk about one of the women that I wrote about, and then Nadia will talk about one of her subjects. Each of us wrote 10 chapters in a 20-chapter book. I want to talk about Margaret Roadnight. Now, many of you will remember her as the amazingly tall folk singer with the terrific voice and the giant afro, who used to sing from the back of trucks during the various moratoriums. And one would imagine that folk singers of the period were sort of born left-wingers. But the interesting thing about Margaret is that she came from a very Catholic background in suburban Melbourne, and she wryly describes herself at one stage as being the only right-wing folk singer in Australia. So what changes Margaret? And as with many of the people we talked to, there was a particular moment or a particular thing that they can point to. And for her, yes, she does mention the importance of having a mentor, a very good friend such as Jeannie Lewis, the very radical folk singer from Sydney, who of course had Communist Party parents. But it wasn't just Jeannie Lewis, but it was one particular song that struck her. And that song was Malvina Reynolds' song, What Have They Done to the Rain? And many of us will remember this song and have no clear memory what it was about. But of course, if you listen to it, and Margaret, of course, did, as she used to sing it in her concerts, it's clear it's about pollution and, of course, nuclear fallout. That's what it's about. And Margaret tells you with chilling detail how she eventually came to realise that, and how the song really changed her attitude to what was going on in the world. And she also talks later about the joy of meeting Malvina Reynolds in California. And Malvina, of course, is best known for writing the Pete Seeger song Little Boxes, which of course we all sang in the 50s and 60s. And Malvina taking Margaret's hand and pointing up to the houses on the hilltop and saying, see, they're the little boxes that I wrote about. So for Margaret, it was, yes, it was the help and support of people like Glenn Tomasetti and Jeannie Lewis, but really was that song that turned her into the thoughtful radical that she became. Nadia.
Okay, well, I'll do Brian Laver, but before I do, I would like to acknowledge that I'm actually here on Cadigal Wongal land of the Eora Nation, and I note that sovereignty was never ceded. So Brian Laver comes from far north Queensland, and he comes from the famous Laver tennis family. Some of you might remember Rod Laver, who in the 1960s was Australia's #1 tennis, or the world's #1 tennis professional. Brian himself was an A-grade player, and he was a university blue in tennis, as well as being the main student leader at Queensland University in the late 60s into the 70s. Brian comes from a family that he describes as cattlemen in the Fitzroy River region of far north Queensland. So in this book, we were looking for people who came from conservative family backgrounds. We didn't want people who came from communist or left backgrounds. We wanted people who would have a change or an enlightenment. Born in 1944, Brian, whose family had moved into the town of Rockhampton, was very aware that the American troops had been based in Rockhampton, and he felt that it was likely that the enemy could have invaded North Queensland. So he grew up from a young boy with this sense of fascism or invasion. But the moment for him came very early. He was 12 years old. He was in his first year at a private boys' school in Rockhampton when a teacher, actually a Conservative teacher, showed the boys film footage of Nazi concentration camps, but also of concentration camps under Stalin, of gulags under Stalin. And Brian describes himself as having in that moment an awakening of what he would come to call anti-totalitarianism. A few months later, the school had its oratory competition for Year 7 boys, and Brian went in it, and he won it with a speech on anti-totalitarianism, whilst the other boys, of course, were talking about their hobbies and their sports. And it became a lifelong passion to fight fascism. He very strongly identifies as a person who is not a communist. He resisted when Bjelke-Petersen described him as such. He has had this commitment to anarchism with a capital A, and he's credited as being the world's only anarchist international tennis coach. So to continue more with the general story, and particularly to return to Meredith and me in the year of our awakening, which was 1968. To outsiders who saw our increasingly frequent arrests, we probably seemed quite surprising radicals. Both of us were from middle class and politically conservative families. Both of us had gone to private schools, private girls' schools. Both of us grew up in what I call the dreary Puritanism of Sydney Anglicanism. And by 1968, both of us were doing English honours, and both of us were at women's college, where both of us really didn't fit into the college ethos. Yet despite these similarities, there was a great difference in our respective backstories. So Meredith will tell you her backstory, her family story, and then I will tell you mine.
Yes, well, my aha moment was purely and simply the war in Vietnam. But as Nadia said, I came from a loving, but on the surface, Menzies voting family in Beecroft. In fact, I didn't find out till I was an adult that my father was a secret Labor voter all his life, because the person in my family who expressed the political opinions was my mother. And she, of course, like most of the rest of Australia, thought that Sir Robert Menzies was a great man. And also, I lived in Beecroft, which was probably at the time the most homogeneous community in the world. We were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant public service families. I didn't even get to speak to a Catholic until I got to university. Now, that seems unlikely, but in those days, that was the way society was. My world was Ming's world, but when I got to university in 1966, strangely, I met a bunch of young Catholic radicals who were in the Newman Society at Sydney University. Goodness knows why I ended up being converted to radicalism by Catholics who I'd never even spoken to until I got to university. But they were all anti-Vietnam, and I started to think seriously about what we were doing. And I was taking the subject government at Sydney University, and our lecturers there were talking about Vietnam. So I started to worry about what my government was doing in my name. They were sending young men off to a country to kill other people in my name. And I still had vestiges of Anglicanism at this stage. I became an atheist later, or about this time. But to me, this was a terrible thing to do, to be killing people without the right to do so. I thought a lot about Vietnam, and the more I learned about it, the more horrified I became. And the more I started to worry about other things that the government might be doing in my name. And I started thinking about their support for the South African system of apartheid, their support for very cruel policies towards Aboriginal people and the lack of rights, and of course the White Australia policy and censorship and all those, and executions, all those things started to become a real issue for me. But my actual realisation that I was now radical was a very sudden moment. I woke up one morning and thought, oh, I think I'm a socialist. So I went into university, and I remember walking down the rather smelly corridor of the McCallum building towards the SRC office, and out came Jeffrey Robertson, who was a great friend of mine at the time. And I remember saying to him, oh, Jeff, I think I'm a socialist. And he said, oh, don't be silly, Meredith, we're all socialists. But after that put down, I went on to become a socialist and very active in so much of what was going on in the period. No.
Okay, well, as I said, our backstories are very different. And unlike Meredith, I fitted the media archetype of the confused young rebel who was venting a personal anger as well as a political anger on the streets. As the result of the death of my mother, which happened when I was 9, I had a dysfunctional and miserable childhood and adolescence. And in Radicals, I described myself as having been a good girl through that period. This wasn't because of any innate qualities of virtue, but simply because growing up in a foster family, I was just scared to say boo about anything. So silenced and disempowered, by 1968, I had a decade of anger and grief bottled up inside me, ready to burst out. But apart from our different family backgrounds, in another way too, I was very different from Meredith. She's described her involvement with the Students' Representative Council. She's described studying government and becoming aware of all these issues, Vietnam, apartheid, and so on. I lived entirely in my brain. Books, literature were my escape. So my intellectual world ran between the epic poem Beowulf and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I never read a newspaper. I never watched television. There was actually only one set in women's college, so most people didn't watch television there. And as far as I knew, by 1968, my knowledge of Vietnam was so zilch that I thought the place was an island. Nevertheless, on Wednesday, the 19th of June, 1968, I joined Meredith on what was her first demonstration downtown and what was my entire political awakening. This was intended to be a kind of vigil on the footpath outside the Minister for Labour and National Services office. It was an anti-conscription demonstration, but it was decided that we would all accompany the small number of petitioners up to give a petition to the Minister. How more sober and polite could that be? We ended up sitting down inside the Minister's office at about 3:30 in the afternoon, 92 of us, and it was one of Australia's first sit-ins. My radical awareness came when the policeman in charge came in and read us the Crimes Act and said we would be liable to 2 years jail. And to me, it seemed utterly disproportionate. It was still office hours. How could you be arrested for sitting on a carpet in an office? And so rather than leaving the building, I stayed there. I was willing to risk 2 years jail for that, and I was duly thrown out of the building. Of course, I wasn't arrested. None of us were arrested that day, but the moment had happened. After that moment, the next day, I started reading a lot, history of Vietnam and conscription, but also Marxist and anarchist texts. And I stress, and I hope this comes up in question time, that we were very much part of the new left rather than the old left. So our Marx was the early Marx. It was the Marx, my Marx was the Marx of alienation. In conclusion to my little personal story, Meredith's referred to the slogan, "The personal is political." And for me, it could not have been truer. My personal liberation was profound, and it came along with the political liberation. For the first time, I had a voice, I had a family, I had a community, And for the first time, I had fun. Meredith.
Okay. So apart from any personal issues we might have brought to our activism, for both of us, as for all the comrades in the book, the catalyst for our radicalisation was the shared experience of growing up in the political circumstances of Australia in the 1950s. Certainly the ferment of the 60s was an international phenomenon, and for young radicals from Berlin to Berkeley, it represented some sort of reaction to a Cold War childhood. But in this country, there was something in particular to drive us wild, and both of us have referred to this a bit. Elected in 1949 to head the first coalition government of the Liberal and Country parties, Prime Minister Robert Gordon Menzies cast a long shadow over the childhood and adolescence of our post-war generation. For a 20-year-old Australian today, who has lived through 7 prime ministers, it would be impossible to imagine how stultifying it was to grow up under a single one, and a patriarchal, conservative one at that. We keep forgetting how unbelievably 40s, 50s colonial Menzies was. It's easy to point to the Menzies government's support for policies such as White Australia and assimilation, not to mention the military commitment in Vietnam. But just as bad was the cultural repression. Growing up behind the white picket fence of Menzies Australia was deadly boring. And Jeff Robertson, when I talked to him, refers to that generation of Australians who escaped overseas in the early 60s. The Robert Hughes, Clive James, Germaine Greer, they escaped because Australia was boring. The later generation, as Jeff points out, escaped Australia because it was bad. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. Often unable to even say what was wrong, we, the demonstrators, knew we had to make our escape using whatever resources we had. Nadia.
Okay, so when were the 60s? It might seem an unnecessary question to ask, but for us, the 60s are a mood and a movement rather than a specific slice of time. And so in Radicals, which is subtitled Remembering the 60s, we define the 60s as the period between 1965 and 1975. So the start of our 60s is marked by the change that happened in the anti-Vietnam movement after the introduction of conscription in November 1964, a change that over the next few years would result not just in more activism, but in widening the support, particularly out into the mums out there who didn't want their boys to get conscripted. 1965 saw the freedom ride for Aboriginal rights, so really kicked off the Aboriginal civil rights movement. 1967, there was the referendum in which a whopping majority of Australians voted for what they saw to be an extension of social justice for Aboriginal people, a promise that still has not been delivered. In January 1966, Menzies finally retired. But the coalition landslide in the federal election later that year was devastating for those who had been hoping that a Labor government would get in and stop the war. Nevertheless, that election result did lead to Gough Whitlam becoming the leader of the ALP. Meanwhile, the anti-Vietnam movement was getting pushed along, escalating, particularly in the result to the street marches and arrests during the visit of American President Lyndon Johnson in October 66 and South Vietnam's Prime Minister, Air Vice Marshal Key in January 1967. By 1968, the explosion of what seemed to be a revolution on the streets of Paris and Prague was mirrored on the streets of Australian cities, Melbourne, Sydney, and I should say we go well beyond Sydney in this book. And even if we didn't have cobblestones to throw at the constabulary. Fast forwarding to 1970, we have the first moratorium, and our decade of the 60s reached midpoint with that. Then moved into the anti-apartheid campaign of 1971. The land rights campaign really took off on the 26th of January 1972, when a small group of Aboriginal people founded the embassy under a beach umbrella outside Old Parliament House. And of course, in November of that year, a majority of Australians voted that it was time for a change. True to his promise, Gough Whitlam brought the troops home from Vietnam, ended conscription, and replaced the White Australia policy with something new called multiculturalism. And all of this was a victory for radicalism. Our 60s, our decade, ends in 1975 with the dismissal of that Labor government and the return of the Liberal Party coalition.
Thanks, Nadia. Now I'd like to talk about another couple of people that we talked to in our chapters. The first one I want to talk about is John Derham. Now, some of you may remember John Derham as the actor that played B.A. Santa Maria in True Believers. In fact, that's always how I see him. That B.A. Santa Maria piece was just so memorable. However, John finds himself as a 17-year-old in Melbourne. He grows up in Melbourne in a very footy-loving, once again, Catholic family. He's not at university, but he is an actor. And as a 17-year-old actor, he ends up by chance at the Emerald Hill Theatre, which was very important in Melbourne as the bringer of different points of view from across the seas. He was very influenced there by the two great leaders of the Emerald Hill Theatre, George Whaley and Wal Cherry. And at this stage, the Emerald Hill Theatre was bringing British playwrights to Australia, and which of course included those very many anti-war plays, and just generally the anti-ruling class plays of the Brits of that period. And why I find John's radicalisation interesting is it was very different to mine and many of the others, where we were looking to America as where we were getting our radical ideas. We were looking at the civil rights movement in America. We were looking at things like the trial of the Chicago 7. And that was, and perhaps even the Paris Spring. But for John, it really was the plays that he was performing in at night and talking about during the day. Plays like Private Yuck Objects, Sergeant Musgrave's Dance, very much the anti-war plays and writings of Spike Milligan. We tend to think of Spike Milligan as just the wonderful goon, but he was also writing very important anti-war material. And of course, John Osborne and John Arden, those playwrights were very important in John thinking about the world in a particular way. And as he says, the other actors were always talking about it and giving you other stuff to read as you were thinking about your part in the play. And so as a young man, he was very influenced by them. But his real aha moment comes when in 1967, when he was 19, he finds himself outside Pentridge Prison at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of February 1967, when Australia hanged Roald Ryan, the last man hanged in Australia. Now, he describes this in chilling detail. He'd been at two minds about whether he would go to the demonstration, but it was very close to where he lived, and he walked down the street to where it was. And he says he can still remember the flight of pigeons that flew up into the air at the clanging of presumably the gallows. And he remembers that so clearly. He finishes this part of his story with the plaintive cry. He says he realised that they're just not listening. And I think that's very redolent of so much of what changed people in that period. We realised that the government wasn't listening. Thanks. Over to Nard.
Okay, well, in this book, we include 3 First Nations stories, those of Gary Foley and Gary Williams from the Gumbanger Nation, and Bronwyn Penrith, whose family are traditional owners around Wallaga Lake. Of course, growing up with systemic racism, most Aboriginal young people don't need a particular moment to make them politically aware. Nevertheless, as Gary Foley tells his story, or as he told it to me, a particular moment stands out. He had a loving and supportive family, and he had a very positive time at primary school in Tenterfield. But by his high school days, he was living in Nambucca and attending Maxville High. He was a very good student, good academically, popular, great at sport, and everything was going wonderfully. When he was in 5th form in 1965, he had one last year to go. But at the end of that year, the principal called him into his office and said to him, "Don't come back next year, Foley." Naturally, Gary asked, "Why not?" And the principal replied, and when Gary told me this, he hit his hand against the cafe table as if he was beating out the words. And he said, the principal replied, "We don't want your kind here." And as Gary described this, he said, and I'm quoting now Gary's words, "When the headmaster did that, he did severe damage to my self-esteem, my self-confidence, and worst of all, he destroyed my belief in education." So Gary left school at that point without finishing his HSC, and it took him 30 years before he went on to tertiary education, of course, to great acclaim. If you look at his website, you'll see that he's now a professor of Aboriginal history, but he's built the most amazing archive of Aboriginal historical resources. So all of us have missed out on a lot of Aboriginal history that would have been told because one principal denied this young Aboriginal man an education. A later moment of Gary's radicalisation was when he came down to Sydney and he was arrested by the notorious 21 Division simply for talking to a girl near Central Station. And like many of us, his sense of injustice was aroused because he didn't do what they arrested him for. And of course, they took him back to the police station and bashed him. And this led on to Gary becoming friends with Paul Coe and a group of other young Aboriginal people, women as well as men, and founding the Aboriginal Legal Service in Redfern. So again, we see a positive piece of action coming out of, or 2 positive bits of action coming out of those 2 radicalising events. Meredith, I'll hand back to you. I won't give another story.
All righto. As these stories show, for our generation, radicalism meant openness and freedom. It meant the particular kind of grassroots organisation and new left ideology that arose in opposition to the hierarchical structures and dogmatism of the old left. Seriously, when we were demonstrating, we hated Stalinists almost as much as we hated the Liberal government. See, for us, our radicalism meant fun, not fundamentalism. Our book does not set out to give a comprehensive history of the era. Rather, it's a bunch of people talking to the 2 of us and through us to each other and to hopefully the reader. This conversation is a collective reminiscence composed of individual awakenings that turn 20 people into radicals. Now, how did we go about writing the book? We began by researching the backgrounds of a variety of people from our generation, looking for those who had experienced some sort of radical turnaround in response either to a particular 60s issue or to what we call the zeitgeist, which was just being caught up in the spirit of the times. Obviously, comrades who came from left-wing family backgrounds didn't fit the bill. So for once, we don't have an Aarons in the mix. We wanted people whose parents had supported the policies of Menzies or the DLP. With one exception, there are no what the Americans call red diaper babies in the book. And that exception is Helen Boyce, who came from a radical family, but she herself turned to Trotskyism, which of course horrified her parents. We also wanted a balance between people who made a predominantly political response to the times and those who expressed their radicalism through art and culture. Halfway through, we thought, look, we don't want this just to be about the politics of the time. We want it to really express the 60s. And you really had to go into those things that personally I didn't believe in, like transcendental meditation and crystals and happenings and all those things. Because the artistic times were so rich and things were happening that totally changed the old boring 50s culture. Our characters span the political spectrum: anarchism, Trotskyism, Maoism, pragmatism, as well as Labor Party members, DLP supporters, the non-aligned, and those who, quote, just wanted to keep their noses clean. And while some of them were our friends, such as Geoffrey Robertson, Josepha Sobski and Peter Duncan, neither of us had previously met Brian Laver, Vivian Binns, LSD Fogg, the lighting guy, Albert Langer or Margaret Roadnight. And can I say, we are delighted we did meet them through this book, and they're now our friends. Once we'd chosen the people, we interviewed them, both of us together, but we wrote up the stories individually. This book isn't just a collection of interview transcripts. In keeping with the notion that the personal is political, our own stories interweave with the stories of the book's participants. When we began writing Radicals, we had no idea how the pieces would come together. That time we call the 60s was made up of so many varied experiences. As it turned out, however, the 20 people we chose to include had more in common than might be apparent at first sight.
So what were the issues that triggered people's first acts of rebellion? And you've already had Brian Laver and John Derham. Before we began the interviews, we thought that Vietnam would be the issue for everyone. So we were surprised to find some very local triggers. And as I've said, our book covers well beyond Sydney. So, for instance, in South Australia, the problem of the Conservative gerrymander loomed large for Peter Duncan. On many campuses, student rights were as important as Vietnam. In Brisbane, the students had to win the right to march on the streets before they could go out and protest about the war. Overall, the twin issues of conscription and Vietnam created an atmosphere of demonstrations and chaos, but that alone wasn't what gripped our generation. Opposition to capital punishment, racism and apartheid, support for land rights, drug law reform, women's rights, gay rights, censorship. There were so many issues that brought our participants out onto the streets.
And although the Australian left was influenced by international ideologies, it was on the whole devoid of the violent aspects of the American and European movements. In Australia, there was no Weather Underground, no Angry Brigade, no Baader-Meinhof gang, none of that for us down under. Now, perhaps this can partly be explained by the fact there is almost no culture at all of political violence in modern Australia, as distinct from the violent massacres of colonial Australia. Also, we had a class-based party that was committed to bringing the troops home. American youth had no democratic road to peace. Both parties were intent on pursuing the war. And that's why I remember so vividly the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Not that I thought Bobby Kennedy was a great man, you know, without flaw, but he had committed to bringing the troops home, and we believed him that he would bring the troops home. And so when he was assassinated, we recognised then that, especially for the Americans, there was no democratic road to stopping the war in Vietnam.
And so, in conclusion, what was the effect of being part of the radical 60s? All of the participants in this book are still radical, and they all believe that the 60s changed them forever. Some were scarred by what happened in the struggles, but all have continued to work for a better world, either at the macro or micro level. So just a few quick examples. Geoffrey Robertson in London, fighting for human rights. Bronwyn Penrith in Redfern, chair of the Aboriginal Women's Organisation Mudgeongal. Gary Williams in Nambucca, helping bring back the Gumbaynja language and teaching it to a new generation. Robbie Swan in Canberra, fighting censorship. Josepha Zobski and Margaret Reynolds continuing to be committed to women's equality. David Marr maintaining his rage against the privilege and power of Australian Tories. Helen Voisey fighting to conserve the heritage shacks on Era Beach. And Vivian Binns and Margaret Roadnight, who are continuing to inspire audiences through visual art and through music. So for all of us, the 60s was about idealism, aspiration and determination. The verities of the 50s were being challenged on the streets and in the lecture theatres. We were determined to change the world, and we did. So now I'll have, if it works, a quick slideshow of some photos showing how we did it, what we did.
There we go. Yep. You want to come around?
Just about 3 seconds for each one will do. We don't need to linger on them, just move them along. There were 6 people in that particular riot. That was how easy it was to start a riot.
Small riot. A mini riot.
Well, it was called a city riot. So Gary and Albert rallying the troops, then the young Helen Voisey speaking to a crowd of 20,000. She was only in high school. Margaret Roadnight at the Moratorium in Melbourne. Brian Labour with his pregnant wife and child, but nevertheless they arrest him for walking down the street. A couple of natty lawyers at the Adelaide Moratorium. Workers' rights is something we haven't yet touched on. So there's Peter Batchelor on the picket line, wearing a duffel coat, of course. Having some fun. Albert Langer drinks milk on a picnic and Robbie Swan has another solution. Angry Redfern. This was staged as part of just a bit of a spoof, really. Some familiar faces. Wonderful Gary Williams and Charles Perkins. They were the first Aboriginal students and that's their first day at university. Art and culture and street theatre. Bronwyn Penrith in street theatre. John Derham at Emerald Hill. Bit of colour, Vivian Binns and LSD Fogg. Women's rights, so we've got Josepha Zobski in a demo for the right of women to drink in the public bar and an abortion demonstration with Margaret Reynolds. The classic photo of Gary Foley in the anti-apartheid movement, an equally classic photo of Meredith Burgmann getting arrested for something Gary Foley did. And us, still out on the streets only a year ago. And the book. Okay, well, thanks for those pictures. And I'll hand over to Gerard.
Okay, well, you've seen the book up on the screen. So we've got signed copies of the book, which you can buy, and I'll put it up on our website tomorrow. And the authors came in and signed the books today. And so, look, we've got 20 minutes. We started 3 minutes late, so we've got 20 minutes, so everyone can be pretty brief with their comments. I want to start off with Meredith, but Nadia can come in if she wants to. You spoke about radicals and you spoke about the commitment of the 1960s radicals to openness and freedom, but heroes of the day among many of the radicals were Ho Chi Minh, who at that stage had presided over a very severe repression in what was then called North Vietnam. Mao Zedong, who at that stage had presided over a forced famine that killed about 40 million people on the Chinese official figures these days. And there were chants of Ho Chi Minh. The front of the book has got a photograph of the National Liberation NLF flag, but that the NLF was controlled by Hanoi, as we know. It was simply an arm of the Chinese Communist Party in Hanoi. I mean, there wasn't much openness and freedom, and you would have witnessed this, particularly Meredith, in your time as a politician, talking to so many of the Vietnamese who came to Australia because they were fleeing the heroes of the radicals of the 1960s.
Yes, certainly there was always a debate within especially the moratorium movement about whether our slogan should be troops out now or victory to the Viet Cong. And of course, the younger radicals wanted victory to the Viet Cong and others wanted troops out now. And I have no problem with supporting Ho Chi Minh against the bombing of Vietnam done by the Americans, in that the war itself should not have been happening. It should not have been happening. Everyone admits that if there had been a totally democratic election in Vietnam at that time, that Ho Chi Minh would have won. And what the Americans were doing were trying to stop that happening. So I have no problem with that. None of us we weren't Maoists, particularly in Sydney. There were Maoists at Monash University, the Red Monash, and Maoists have always been quite strong in Melbourne. But interestingly enough, in Sydney, the strain from the 40s and 50s that went through into the 60s was more like anarchism. The Sydney left was much more anarchist than it was Maoist. So I think it's wrong to claim that the left that were demonstrating against the war were in fact Maoists. On the whole, they weren't.
Yes, and I'd like to throw in that this book has a spectrum of people. And for instance, Brian Laver in Brisbane would to this day say things about Ho Chi Minh exactly the same as what you have just said, Gerard. And so from his anarchist and anti-totalitarian position, he had a problem with people chanting Ho Chi Minh. And so there was a broad spectrum in those times of different views. And I think that is part of the openness that was about. And earlier today, when we were in visiting you, and you mentioned Keith Windshuttle, and we said, yeah, well, Keith was a mate of ours. And in those days, it was perfectly reasonable, for example, for Peter Manning in our book to be converted partly through talks with Brian Ahrens from the Communist Party, Mike Madison, who was another capital A anarchist and the famous draft dodger, and also Hall Greenland, who was a capital T Trotskyist in those days. And so there was a lot of openness in discussion and debate. It wasn't just ideological bulldozing with views.
We're going to Ida Lichter, who's a capital I, Ida.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Meredith and Nadia, for these very valuable recollections. How have your views developed over the years, and which political issues do you find most compelling today?
Meredith, you go first.
Oh, well, I suspect that it was who was it, Churchill or someone said that, you know, socialists when you're young and then more conservative as you get older. I haven't got more conservative. I suspect I have become more realistic about what governments can achieve. You know, when you're young, you think, oh, we'll just say they've got to do this and then they've got to do that. And I recognised when I saw Barack Obama, who I had gone over and supported in both his elections, I'd, you know, done those weird things that Americans do in elections. But I had seen him struggle to get stuff done, because getting stuff done in government is so much harder than people realise. So I think that, so my views haven't changed. I still believe in the same things, but I'm less judgmental about people not being able to do it as quickly as I would want them to. And what was the other bit you asked?
What issues are we still passionate about?
I still see the colonial war against the First Nations people of Australia as a great unfinished business. in Australia. And I think it's an outrage that we still have a government that refused to even talk about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I think that's terrible. And of course, climate change. But personally speaking, I suspect my commitment to First Nations.
Yes.
Now, for technical, I think we'll move on. For technical reasons, Dennis can't get his questions up, but Dennis wants to know about the influence of the left on the ABC in the 1960s, and then we'll go to Ruthie. So,
okay, I just want to say I just want to answer Ida because it's a fabulous question. Thanks, Ida. And for me too, it's Aboriginal land rights and Aboriginal social justice rights. And on a day when yet another person has died in custody, we cannot do anything but think of that situation today. But also refugees, and that's an issue that has slipped off the radar in the COVID era. Okay, sorry, move on to that next question.
I'm sorry, I thought you'd answered that. So there's a question about the ABC. I mean, Peter Manning's in your book. He went to the ABC. David Marr's in your book. He spent a lot of time at the ABC. Is there any, the question is was there any influence of the left on the ABC in the 60s, or the period between 65 and 75, which is the period you cover in the book? And then we'll go to Ruthie.
I wasn't aware of any influence on the ABC in that period. When Peter Manning went there, it was somewhat later, I think. You know, we found it very hard to get our stories out in those days, whether into the print media or into other forms of media. And one of the reasons why we had to go onto the streets was because that was our only form of social media. I mean, remembering that there was no Twitter, there was no ability to use the kinds of media that people use these days. And so going downtown, which as well as the sort of thrill of going down for demonstrations, you spent a lot of time going down, handing out leaflets outside town hall. There was a lot of boring hack work in it, as well as the few moments of exhilarating thrill of being at the wrong end of a police wedge. So getting anything into any media was difficult.
So we go to Ruthie. Is that right? Is anyone there?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
here you go.
I really don't have anything else to add. I just made a comment in the chat, that's all.
Oh, okay, okay, I get it. So where do we go?
I can't get in front of a screen. I'm sorry, I'm coming on from the side because I'm helping here. Meredith and Nadia particularly, there seem to be parallels with today's kind of protest and deconstructions, ideas, whatever. How much was it a personal sort of outburst that your voice wasn't heard? We hear that so much today. I want to have a voice. Even the Duchess of Sussex keeps saying she wants to have a voice. Is it a generational thing? And was that so much part of it? Because you say people came for all sorts of different reasons. To what extent was it just a kind of need to make a noise to be heard because you were the, I suppose, younger generation and not making the laws or defending the status quo?
Well, I think for me personally, having a voice was incredible. And so having been so quiet for so long, so silenced, to get out onto the streets and scream, to actually use my vocal cords was an incredible thing, just as it was incredible to link arms with people. It was incredible to be able to have friendships with male people that were not sexual friendships, that were comradeship. So all of those things were very important, but certainly having a voice through not just yelling things out, but also writing things, giving out pamphlets, all of that was having a voice. But in the stories that we've told tonight, we haven't particularly focused on feminist issues, so they've come up in a couple of the pictures. And of course, all women at that time were suffering even more than they were today in not having a voice. So the women's liberation stories, which come into the stories in this book of, for instance, Josepha Zobski and Margaret Reynolds were very, very important. You're looking at a time when women weren't even allowed into the public bar of hotels, and let alone issues of gender equity in pay and other issues. Meredith, you might want to speak more about that.
Yeah, I do think the fact that there was no social media at that time, and Nadia's referred to how hard it was to get your story out. For me personally, I was still very, I mean, I'd lost my religion, but I still had all those Anglican or Christian things about, you know, you must be true to yourself and all those things. And for me, the fact that I had to say this killing was wrong. And for me, I was horrified by the fact that young Australians were being killed, but I was horrified by the fact that this killing was happening in my name. It was a very Christian ethical thing that was going on. So I had to go out into the streets because that was the only thing I could do. I could chalk up, get out of Vietnam now on some wall, but going out into the streets was the equivalent of having a big Twitter account, I suspect.
And as a young woman, I felt that, you know, I wasn't liable for conscription, boys were, and I felt that was actually a situation whereby they, unusually perhaps in history, were carrying more of the burden. So as a young woman, I felt it obligatory to speak up on the Vietnam issue.
Getting close to, I missed anyone, we're getting close to the end. So can I just ask you both to reflect on Australian society at the time, and you've given very interesting case studies of very interesting individuals here tonight. I mean, I just wonder whether, as someone who lived through the period, whether Australia was as boring as you portrayed in the 50s into the 60s, and as whether people here were as alienated as you seem to suggest. If you look, I mean, you know this well. Menzies wins in 49, and then the Liberals and the Nationals win again in 51. 54, 55, 58, 61, 65, 66 and 69. So, you know, people were as alienated and life was as boring and was oppressive and difficult. How did that happen?
It happened because that generation, who were our parents' generation, the Menzies voters, had been through, they were the Depression generation, they'd been through the terrible time of the Depression, followed by the terrible time of World War II, and they wanted safety. They wanted safety more than something new. And they thought they were doing the right thing by us. We had shoes on our feet, fillings in our teeth, mashed potato or chops and 3 veg on our plates, and they thought they were doing the right thing for us. But you've got to look at a time when there was no Australian film industry for a start. There was massive censorship of books. Lady Chatterley's Lover, for instance, was one book that was censored at that time. Women were regarded as being back in the home, back in the kitchen. It was a time of boredom. And yes, for people who'd been through a terrible couple of decades, boredom seemed good. But for us, boredom just seemed boring.
Meredith?
Well, boredom is, I'm sure the people that Nadia described who were our parents' generation in the suburbs, they probably weren't bored. They were going to church, talking to their neighbours who were exactly the same as them. You know, there was no diversity in the culture. There was no diversity in the things they did. And so they weren't bored because that was their life. But us growing up in that period and seeing what was happening overseas, for the first time we were seeing on television was very important. We were seeing on television things that were happening overseas, and particularly we were seeing what was happening in Vietnam. And so I think that our generation there was going to be revolution no matter what. It really was a very, very one-dimensional society we were coming out of.
And just a postscript, I wrote the biography of Charmian Clift, who wrote a very, very radical weekly column that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Herald. And her readership was middle-class, middle-aged women who read the women's pages. And so there was this sort of subterranean group of people who were changing and who were wanting to have new views. It wasn't only young people. If it was, we wouldn't have had the result in the 1972 election. It was a much bigger group of people wanting change.
Now, we've had a couple of latecomers, so we're going to finish with John Hook and then Michael Kirby, and that's it. So, John?
Yes, I was in a Brian Labour demonstration, a legal demonstration legally in 1970. And back then, the left was standing for freedom of speech against the Christian right that wanted to censor books, which you mentioned. Nowadays, it seems to me things are completely turned topsy-turvy, and the left is hugely repressive, hugely totalitarian against free speech. I'm thinking of Bettina Arndt, Eddie Opinions and others. And the Christian right is standing up for people, for example, is Israel Folau. So what's happened to freedom of speech that was such a strong part of that 60s radical movement?
I think what you're referring to, of course, is the hate legislation, which it's basic. And I, as an old anarchist and a civil libertarian, really had to struggle with myself when they first brought this in as the discriminatory speech on race grounds. And it wasn't until because at first I opposed it, you know, on good sort of civil libertarian grounds, but we had a lot of discussion about it. And some civil libertarians still opposed it. But in the end, I supported it because you are not exercising free speech if what you are doing is taking away someone else's right to feel safe in society. It's as simple as that. Everyone in the society, first of all, has a right to feel safe. And if you're going to say things which make homosexuals or Aborigines or Chinese citizens, if you're going to say things that make them feel unsafe, I agree with legislation against that.
Right to go on? Okay, so Michael. Final question, Michael Kirby.
Yeah, thank you both for this excellent discussion, and thanks for your book, and thanks, Meredith, for the earlier book on ASIO files. And my question was prompted by the photograph of you getting arrested, and in such an unseemly way for a future president of the Legislative Council. Wonderful, and it's great that our country has had and has different viewpoints. I think that's terrific. But I would like to know whether ASIO played any part in the story of the radicals that you've recounted in this new book, and whether it was in any way consequential upon ASIO that Australia was, as you think, very boring and nothing ever happened.
Well, in the original book, of which Michael, of course, was in it because he had an ASIO file, I did mention there that often the people who were very, very badly affected by ASIO were often just the friends or acquaintances of people like me who were being followed. I mean, it never worried me that I had an ASIO file, but one of my friends who was in the Navy ended up having his life ruined by the fact that his name was in my address book, and my address book was stolen by ASIO, and they wrote it all out, and then they spent the next 20 pages of my ASIO file trying to track down this guy and what he was doing, and telling his Navy overlords that they had to bring him back from where he was and put himself. It was a terrible, terrible revelation for me to discover that my activities were ruining someone else's life. So yes, I did ruin people's lives in that period. Not always the ones that you would think. But of the people in our book, ASIO would have had almost all of them on their records. I should do that and check how many of them have ASIO files, but the poor old archives, National Archives, you might have read the article which says that they've run out of money and the present government won't give them any money. But so it takes a very long time now to get your ASIO file because archives can't keep up with the requests. But I will do that.
Can I just, as a little humorous postscript to end this session, tell you the story of Brian Laver's ASIO file, which followed him around and caused him to be unable to get jobs in either Queensland or Victoria, and he had a wife and young children to support. But so finally he went one day, he had an honours degree in history, he went one day for a job at a Zionist school, or a school he describes it in that way. And when he went into the principal's office for his interview, he sees a big fat file on the table and he thinks, oh, this is another job I won't get. So to keep it short, he says to the principal, oh, I see you've got my ASIO file. And the principal says, no, this isn't an ASIO file, this is your Mossad file. And Brian said, I didn't know I had a Mossad file. And the principal flicks through it and it says, Mossad say that you're willing to fight against fascists. Is that true? And Brian said, yeah, that's true. I'll fight against fascists. And the principal said, you got the job. So sometimes these secret organisations can have unexpected results.
That's a lovely way to end up. I'm still trying to work out how Brian became an anarchist tennis coach. I just wonder if they gave away with all the lines or what they did.
No nets.
No nets.
Well, he did. Actually, he taught Prince Andrew to play tennis. So there you go.
I don't think you should have told us that. Look, many thanks to both Meredith Burgmann and Nadia Wheatley. We got these books for sale, but I'll just show you the signatures that were done today. I think they went to the same school.
The old school.
The handwriting is very similar. If ASIO was still around, the old way, we'd put them onto that. So look, many thanks to both you and thanks to our people who joined in and asked important questions and made comments. And it was a good night and we must do it again sometime.
Indeed.
Many thanks.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Gerard, and thank you, Anne. And thank you all for all the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.